What exactly is going on in that grey, mushy matter in between our ears? Advances in technology over the last decade have brought us fresh insight into how the brain works. I'm here with a man who spends his time delving into the intricacies of the brain, examining, through neural imaging, how we make decisions and how the brain works. I'm here with Professor John O'Doherty, Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at Trinity College Dublin. Professor, welcome. It seems that there's been a tidal wave of advances in technology over the last decade regarding neuroscience. Can you tell me, what have we actually learned in the last decade or so about the brain?
Well, what we're starting to learn, and really what we've been doing, I'd say over probably the last 15 years, is mapping out different parts of the brain and really starting to get an idea of what sort of different functions those individual parts of the brain are involved in. And I think we're at the point now where we have a pretty good idea broadly what different parts of the brain are kind of concerned with, focused on.
The unconscious is often seen as a mysterious side of the human psyche. What has your research actually revealed about the unconscious?
Okay, so one of the really amazing things is that a lot of what's going on in the brain is probably not something that we're consciously aware of. And an example of this, a very simple example, would be if you learn to ride a bicycle. So at the very early stages, when you're sort of learning to ride a bicycle, you're kind of paying attention to everything. You're saying, I have to, try and move this way, balance the other way to avoid falling off. But very quickly, you start to do this automatically. And a lot of what's going on in our brain is actually not something that we have any conscious access to at all. So if anything, what we're learning is that most of what's going on in the brain is actually unconscious.
You specialise in decision-making. How do we make decisions, and indeed, are we actually any good at it?
The way I think about the brain is actually it's a device that is honed by evolution to be very, very efficient at making decisions. And the kind of decisions that we make are we choose those actions that maximise the good things that we can get, the rewards, we call them rewards, things that improve our chances of survival, so things like food, things that improve our chances of procreating or exploiting our environment so that we flourish. And that's what the brain is optimised to do, is to make decisions so that we can actually promote our chances of survival and reproducing. And what we think is going on in the brain is that we can actually make reference to economic theory. So economists, what they say is that any human being acts to maximise his or her expected utility. And what that means is you just act to optimise the amount of good things that you can get and minimise the amount of bad things that you can get. And what we think is going on in the brain is the brain actually learns to have a representation of how good it thinks the outcome is going to be for a particular action. So whether it is, if you're making a decision about what sort of food should I have for dinner tonight? Should I have pizza or should I have Chinese? What you're actually thinking about when you're making that decision is you're trying to weigh up what are the pros and cons of actually going and having a Chinese versus having a pizza. And you're basically going to make a decision that you think is the best outcome for you, given what you know of the situation. And that's what we think. The brain has representations. There are neurons in the brain that encode the value of things or the utility of things in the world. And then those neurons are the signals that you use to make decisions.
What about our ability to assess risk and our neurological responses to that risk? Are we any good at that? How is that process working?
Well, clearly, humans are very sensitive to risk. So if I asked you, which would you prefer, £1,000 for sure, or say £2,500 with a 50-50, I'll just flick a coin. Mm-hmm. So most people, or a lot of people, would say, I'd actually rather have the £1,000 for sure. But actually, the overall expected value, so if I asked you this 10,000 times, the amount of money you'd actually win for playing the gamble will be more than what you get for taking the £1,000 for sure. But so people are very sensitive to risk. And maybe that makes sense because, of course, there is a risk involved in that you might end up with nothing if you chose the gamble. And maybe if you want to survive, it's better to actually be safe sometimes and choose the smaller amount where you're guaranteed you're going to be able to go out and buy your pizza or your Chinese, whichever you prefer, rather than being stuck with nothing and then not being able to go off and buy your evening meal. And we're starting to look at how, when you're making a decision, how risk is evaluated in the brain. And we're getting an idea. So what we do is we put people in the brain scanner and we give them choices in which they have to decide between just the choice that I gave you, something like that, except we can't pay them £1,000. It's a bit expensive. But we give them similar choices for smaller amounts of money, and we look at the kind of decision that they make, and then we look at the riskiness that was involved in that decision. And what we can show is that certain parts of the brain encode not only the value, which is the £1,000 versus the 2,500, but also encodes the riskiness involved in different decision options. So clearly that information is represented in the brain, and it's used and integrated somehow to help you make choices.
What does the future hold for neuroscience?
Over the last 15 years or so, I think what we've been trying to do, as I mentioned before, is map what functions different parts of the brain are involved in. But that's not really the full story. So what we really want to do is treat the brain as if it were a computer. Okay, so that's, the analogy we have is thinking about the brain as a computational device, as a device that processes information and then produces output, which is behavior. And we're only now starting to unravel what the actual computations or algorithms or computer programs the brain is using to solve particular problems. And I think over the next several decades, we're going to start to get more and more of an idea, not only just what brain areas are active or what brain areas are doing particular things, but what computations, what sort of algorithms, what rules are these parts of the brain using to solve problems.
Okay, are we talking here about heading towards having a genuine artificial intelligence?
Well, I think that has to be one of the side effects of understanding the brain properly, is that I think ultimately that will feed back into efforts in AI and computer science to build artificial intelligence. The more we understand about how real brains solve problems, the better we'll be able to build artificial intelligence.
Psychology and neuroscience have quite an interesting relationship. Is it mind or is it brain? How indeed do they interrelate?
Well, there's actually a very close relationship between psychology and neuroscience. So in order to understand how the brain works, we need to understand how the brain produces behavior. And of course what psychology is, it's the science of behavior. So psychologists over the last 100 years or more have been concerned with trying to develop techniques and also theoretical approaches to trying to understand how people behave. And those sorts of ideas that have come from psychology are indispensable when trying to understand how the brain works, because we need to understand how neural activity translates to behavior, and for that you actually need to invoke ideas from psychology. So there's an incredibly intimate relationship between those two fields. I should mention that one of the recent developments that's in many ways the field that I'm focusing on is decision neuroscience and neuroeconomics. Another recent development is that ideas from economics are starting to come in as well. And that was actually something that hadn't happened up until very recently. I think that's a relatively new development, is that not only are we using ideas from psychology, but we're also starting to use concepts and sort of mathematical formulations that the economists have developed in trying to think about how people function and how brains function.
Okay. Professor, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.